There's nothing quite like watching your dignity get crushed in front of strangers who'll never remember your name. For Eli Ramirez, that moment came in a glass-walled boardroom where tech CEO Avery Sinclair dismissed his engineering experience like it was worth nothing. 3 days later, her mansion was burning, and his 9-year-old daughter was begging him not to go back inside. But Eli had been a firefighter for 15 years before unemployment knocked him down. Some things you never forget, even when pride tells you to walk away. He pulled Avery from those flames, and the headlines called him a hero. What they didn't know was that saving her life would force them both to face the deeper fires they'd been running from. Two broken people, thrust together by tragedy, discovering that sometimes the person who hurts you most becomes the one you're meant to heal. Can redemption bloom from the ashes of humiliation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning alarm pierced through the thin walls of the Ballard apartment at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Eli Ramirez had set it to ring. He'd been awake anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a question mark fitting, since his entire life had become one giant question with no clear answer. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 18 months of unemployment. "Daddy," Sophie's voice drifted from the bedroom they shared, soft and drowsy. At 9 years old, she had the kind of intuition that came from watching her father struggle in silence, reading his moods like weather patterns. "Just getting ready for that interview, Mija," Eli called back, pulling on his one good shirt, the navy blue one Maria had bought him for their anniversary 3 years ago, before the cancer. Before everything changed. The apartment was small but clean, every surface maintained, with the precision of someone who had learned that order was sometimes the only thing you could control. Eli had arranged Sophie's art supplies in neat rows on the kitchen table, her colored pencils organized by spectrum. Her latest drawing was taped to the refrigerator, a stick figure in a red helmet, standing next to a fire truck, with "My Hero Daddy" written in purple crayon across the top. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her dark hair sleep-tousled, clutching the worn, stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since her mother died. "Are you nervous?" Eli knelt to her level, straightening the collar of her pajamas. "A little, but you know what Mama used to say about butterflies in your stomach. They're just getting ready to help you fly," Sophie finished, managing a sleepy smile. The truth was, Eli hadn't felt much like flying lately. The Seattle job market had been brutal for an ex-firefighter with a bachelor's in engineering who'd been out of the corporate world for 15 years. Most human resources departments saw the gap in his resume and moved on to the next candidate. They didn't see the man who had saved 43 lives during his career, who had earned commendations for bravery, who had rebuilt engines and designed safety protocols in his spare time. The therapy schedule was pinned to the corkboard above the kitchen counter, a grid of appointments that cost more than their monthly rent. Sophie's occupational therapy, speech therapy, and counseling sessions, all necessary, all expensive, all reminders of how the accident that had claimed Maria's life had also left their daughter with challenges that insurance barely covered. "Mrs. Chen is picking you up at 8. Eli said, buttering Sophie's toast in perfect squares the way she needed them. "Remember the rules about the car ride? Seatbelt first, then count to 10 before we start moving," Sophie recited. "And if I feel overwhelmed, I can ask to stop and breathe." That's my girl. Next door, the Chens were already bustling about their morning routine. David Chen had been Eli's partner at Station 19, before the department cuts had forced them both to find new paths. David had landed a job with a private security firm. Eli had been less fortunate. But David's wife, Linda, had become Sophie's unofficial grandmother, picking her up for school and watching her after therapy sessions without ever making it feel like charity. At 7:30, Eli stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time. The man looking back at him was 42 years old, but felt ancient. His black hair was threaded with silver now, and lines had etched themselves around his brown ice knot from laughter, but from the weight of carrying too much alone. Still, he was clean-shaven and presentable, his shoulders squared with the posture of someone who had faced down flames and lived to tell about it. The job was at Sinclair Technologies, a company that had made headlines for its innovative approach to urban safety systems. Their fire suppression technology was being implemented in cities across the country, and they needed someone with real-world experience to consult on their latest products. On paper, Eli was perfect for the position. In reality, he knew he was competing against candidates with MBAs and corporate experience, people who spoke the language of quarterly reports and market penetration. "You've got this, Daddy," Sophie said, hugging his legs as he prepared to leave. "Remember, you're the bravest person I know." The words hit him harder than she could understand. Brave. He'd been called that before, back when bravery meant running into burning buildings. Now it meant walking into boardrooms where his working-class accent and calloused hands marked him as different, where his 15-year gap in corporate experience felt like a chasm he couldn't bridge. The bus ride to downtown Seattle took 45 minutes, giving Eli time to review his notes and practice his talking points. He'd researched Sinclair Technologies thoroughly, memorizing their product lines and recent acquisitions. The company was headed by Avery Sinclair, a woman who had inherited the business from her father and transformed it from a small safety equipment manufacturer into a billion-dollar enterprise. At 38, she was known for her brilliance and her ruthlessness in equal measure. The Sinclair Technologies building dominated 3 blocks of downtown Seattle, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. Eli had driven past it countless times during his firefighting career, responding to calls in the surrounding area. Now he was walking through its gleaming lobby, past abstract sculptures and digital displays, showcasing the company's achievements. "Mr. Ramirez?" The receptionist's smile was practiced, but not unkind. "Miss Sinclair will see you in conference room A. It's on the 42nd floor." The elevator ride felt eternal. Eli checked his reflection in the polished steel doors, straightened his shoulders, and reminded himself why he was here. Sophie's therapy, the overdue rent, the chance to use his knowledge and experience to make a difference again. Conference room. A was a temple to corporate success, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. The long table was surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Eli's monthly income. At the head of the table sat Avery Sinclair, and she was nothing like the professional photos on the company website. She was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and auburn hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her charcoal suit was tailored to precision, and her pale green eyes held the kind of intelligence that could cut through pretense like a blade. She was flanked by 3 other executives, all in their 30s, all looking like they'd stepped from the pages of a business magazine. "Mr. Ramirez," Avery said, not rising from her chair. "Please, sit." Eli took the chair across from her, noting how the sun from the windows created a natural spotlight effect, making him feel exposed while keeping her partially in shadow. It was a power play, subtle but effective. "I've reviewed your application," she continued, opening a folder that contained his resume. 15 years as a firefighter, bachelor's degree in engineering from the University of Washington. Impressive in its way. The phrase, "in its way," hung in the air like smoke. Eli forced himself to smile. "Thank you. I believe my hands-on experience with fire suppression systems and emergency response protocols could bring valuable insight to your safety technology division." "Valuable insight," Avery repeated, her tone suggesting she was tasting the words and finding them wanting. "Tell me, Mr. Ramirez, what makes you think that knowledge gained from—" She glanced at his resume. "Responding to house fires and cat-in-tree rescues translates to developing cutting-edge technology for urban environments." One of the other executives suppressed a snicker. Eli felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice steady. "With respect, Mrs. Sinclair, I've responded to high-rise fires, chemical plant explosions, and multi-vehicle accidents. I've seen firsthand how safety systems fail under pressure, and I've designed modifications that have saved lives. Modifications, Avery said, leaning back in her chair, to existing systems. We're not looking for someone to patch holes, Mr. Ramirez. We're looking for innovation. Innovation comes from understanding real-world applications, Eli replied, his voice gaining strength. I've studied your thermal imaging integration system. It's impressive technology, but in actual fire conditions, smoke density can interfere with the imaging algorithms. I've developed workarounds that— Mr. Ramirez, Avery interrupted, her voice sharp as winter wind. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we're not running a charity here. This position requires someone who can think beyond the limitations of manual labor and emergency response. Someone who understands the complexities of modern business. The words hit like a physical blow, manual labor, as if saving lives was somehow less valuable than creating PowerPoint presentations. Eli looked around the table, seeing the smug expressions of the other executives, and felt something inside him crack. I understand, he said quietly, standing from his chair. Thank you for your time. As he walked toward the door, Avery's voice followed him. Mr. Ramirez, good luck with your future endeavors. I'm sure you'll find something more suitable to your skill set. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into hell. Eli's hands shook as he pressed the button for the lobby, and he caught his reflection in the steel doors again. The same man who had entered the building an hour ago, but somehow diminished, as if Avery Sinclair's words had actually made him smaller. Outside, Seattle's autumn air felt like a slap after the climate-controlled perfection of the office building. Eli walked 2 blocks before finding a coffee shop where he could sit and process what had just happened. He ordered a black coffee, no fancy additions he couldn't afford, and found a corner table. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda Chen. Sophie did great in therapy today. She drew a picture of you getting the job. How did it go? Eli stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, still waiting to hear. He couldn't bring himself to crush Sophie's hope just yet. There would be time for that conversation later when he got home and had to explain why Daddy wouldn't be starting a new job on Monday. Why they'd have to figure out another way to pay for her therapy sessions. Why the stick figure drawing of her hero daddy might need to come down from the refrigerator. The coffee shop was filled with the usual mix of freelancers and students, people who seemed to have figured out how to navigate this new economy while he remained stranded in the old one. Eli pulled out his phone and opened the job search app, scrolling through listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Seeking dynamic individual with proven track record in customer engagement and brand optimization. Looking for passionate innovator ready to disrupt traditional paradigms. He closed the app and stared out the window at the people walking past, each one carrying their own stories of success and failure, hope and disappointment. Somewhere in this city, Sophie was probably telling her therapist about how her daddy was going to get a great job and everything would be okay. Somewhere else, Avery Sinclair was probably already interviewing the next candidate, someone with an MBA and a vocabulary that matched her expectations. The afternoon stretched ahead like an empty road. Eli finished his coffee and walked to the bus stop, joining the crowd of people heading home from their real jobs to their real lives. Tomorrow, he would start the process over again, updating his resume, searching for openings, crafting cover letters that made his experience sound relevant to employers who valued credentials over capability. But tonight, he would go home to Sophie and pretend that everything was fine. He would help her with her homework, read her a story, and tuck her into bed with the stuffed elephant that had belonged to her mother. He would be the father she deserved, even if he couldn't be the provider she needed. The bus pulled up, and Eli climbed aboard, settling into a seat near the window. As the city passed by in a blur of glass and steel, he tried to push Avery Sinclair's words from his mind. Manual labor. Suitable to your skill set. The condescension in her voice when she'd said, in its way. He had no idea that in just 3 days, he would be running toward flames again, not because it was his job, but because it was who he was. and the woman who had crushed his dignity in that boardroom would be the one whose life depended on his willingness to risk everything for someone who had shown him nothing but contempt. Some stories begin with hope. Others begin with humiliation. This one began with both. 3 days after the interview, Eli was still carrying the weight of Avery Sinclair's dismissal like a stone in his chest. He'd managed to keep the worst of it from Sophie, but children have a way of sensing when their world is less stable than it appears. She'd been quieter than usual, more clingy during their evening routine, as if she could sense the invisible cracks spreading through their carefully constructed life. It was nearly midnight when the emergency radio scanner crackled to life in their apartment. Eli had kept the old device from his firefighting days, partly out of habit and partly because some instincts never fully die. The static-filled voice of the dispatcher cut through the quiet night like a blade. Structure fire, 2,847 Magnolia Drive. Multiple units responding. Possible occupant trapped. Magnolia Drive. Eli knew that address it was the exclusive cliffside neighborhood where Seattle's elite built their fortress-like homes overlooking Puget Sound. But something about the address nagged at him, a familiarity he couldn't quite place until he remembered the business articles he'd read while researching Sinclair Technologies. Avery Sinclair lived on Magnolia Drive. "Daddy?" Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "What's that noise?" "Just the radio, Mija. Go back to bed." But Eli was already reaching for his jacket, his body moving with the muscle memory of 15 years, responding to emergency calls. He told himself he was just curious, that he would drive by and see what was happening. It had nothing to do with the woman who had humiliated him in front of her colleagues. "Where are you going?" Sophie asked, more alert now. "Just for a drive. Mrs. Chen will watch you, okay?" 20 minutes later, Eli stood behind the police barricade, watching Avery Sinclair's modernist mansion burn against the night sky. The house was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, cantilevered over the cliff like a ship's prow cutting through darkness. Now it was a beacon of orange flame, smoke billowing into the starless sky. Fire Chief Martinez, Eli's former boss, spotted him in the crowd. "Ramirez, what are you doing here?" "Heard it on the scanner. Any casualties?" Martinez's expression was grim. "Owner's car is in the garage, but we can't get close enough to confirm if anyone's inside. The structure's compromised. The whole north wing is about to collapse." Eli studied the building with the practiced eye of someone who had made these assessments countless times. The fire had started in the lower level and was working its way up, but there was still a narrow window of opportunity. The main staircase would be impassable, but the service stairs on the east side might still be viable. What about aerial approach? "Ladder truck can't get close enough because of the cliff. We're treating it as a total loss and focusing on containment." Eli watched the flames dance behind the massive windows of what had probably been Avery's home office. Through the smoke and heat distortion, he caught a glimpse of movement, something pale against the interior darkness. A person. "Martinez, there's someone in there." "Where?" "Second floor, east wing, behind the glass wall." Martinez followed Eli's pointing finger and grabbed his radio. "Torres, do you have visual on the second floor, east wing?" "Negative, Chief. Too much smoke from this angle." But Eli had seen enough. The figure had been brief but unmistakable, someone moving, which meant someone alive and conscious. Trapped but alive. "I'm going in," Eli said, stepping toward the equipment truck. "Like hell you are. You're not even on the department anymore." "That's Avery Sinclair in there." Martinez paused. "The tech CEO? How do you know?" "Because I interviewed with her 3 days ago. She lives here. Her car's in the garage, and I just saw her moving around the second floor." The words hung between them for a moment. Martinez knew Eli better than most knew, that when he said he'd seen someone, he'd seen someone. Knew that Eli had never backed down from a rescue, even when the odds were impossible. "The structure won't hold much longer," Martinez said. "Even if you got in, the floor could collapse before you reached her." Eli was already pulling on borrowed turnout gear, his movements automatic despite the months away from the job. "The service stairs are still intact." I can reach the second floor, grab her, and be out in under 10 minutes. Ramirez. She might be unconscious from smoke inhalation. If she collapses, she won't make it to a window. Martinez looked at the burning house, then at Eli, calculating risks and probabilities the way fire chiefs had to do. Finally, he nodded. 10 minutes, then I'm pulling everyone back. Sophie's sleepy voice echoed in Eli's memory as he approached the building. You're the bravest person I know. He thought about Avery's dismissive tone, her casual cruelty. The way she'd made him feel small and worthless. He thought about walking away, letting someone else handle this. Instead, he stepped through the shattered glass door and into the inferno. The heat hit him like a physical force, even through the protective gear. Smoke filled his mask's viewport, turning the world into a hellscape of orange shadows and dancing demons. The service stairs were intact, but slick with condensation and debris. Eli climbed steadily, counting steps, monitoring his air supply, listening for the telltale sounds of structural failure. The second floor was a maze of contemporary furniture and abstract art, all of it now silhouetted against the glow of approaching flames. Eli moved methodically through the space, calling out despite knowing his voice wouldn't carry over the roar of the fire. He found her in what had been her home office, collapsed near a desk that probably cost more than his annual income. Avery Sinclair lay unconscious, her perfect business attire scorched and torn, her auburn hair singed. She looked smaller than she had in the boardroom, vulnerable in a way that cut through his anger like cold water. Eli checked her pulse weak, but steady and lifted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The return trip was more difficult, his vision obscured by smoke, the stairs now treacherous with water and foam from the suppression efforts. Behind them, he could hear the groaning of steel beams beginning to fail. They emerged from the building just as the east wing's support structure gave way, sending a cascade of glass and metal tumbling toward the cliff below. Eli laid Avery on the stretcher as paramedics swarmed around them, checking vitals and setting up oxygen. "Good work, Ramirez," Martinez said, clapping him on the shoulder, just like old times. But Eli wasn't listening. He was watching Avery's face as consciousness slowly returned, seeing the confusion and fear replace her usual composed mask. When her eyes finally focused on him, there was a moment of recognition, followed by something he couldn't quite identify: surprise, perhaps, or maybe gratitude. "The interview," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. "Don't try to talk," the paramedic said, adjusting her oxygen mask. But Avery's eyes remained locked on Eli's. In them, he saw not the imperious CEO who had dismissed his worth, but simply a woman who had nearly died and was struggling to understand why the man she'd humiliated had risked his life to save her. The media arrived as they were loading Avery into the ambulance. News vans and camera crews materialized from the darkness like scavengers drawn to drama. Someone had already posted cell phone footage on social media, shaky video of Eli emerging from the burning building with Avery over his shoulder, backlit by flames, like a scene from an action movie. "Sir, can you tell us your name?" A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "I need to get home to my daughter," Eli said, pushing past the cameras. But the damage was already done. By morning, the footage would be viral, the headlines writing themselves. "Hero saves tech, CEO from burning mansion." The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had declared him unsuitable for meaningful work was alive because of skills she'd dismissed as manual labor. The drive home was surreal, the ordinary streets of Seattle feeling alien after the chaos of the fire scene. Eli's hands still shook slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly leaving his system. He'd pulled people from burning buildings before, but this felt different, personal, complicated. Mrs. Chen was waiting in their apartment, having moved to the couch when the emergency scanner had awakened her too. "Everything okay?" she asked. "There was a fire. I helped out." She studied his soot-stained clothes and the scent of smoke that clung to him despite his shower. "Just like old times." "Something like that." Sophie was still sleeping, one arm wrapped around her stuffed elephant, the other flung across the pillow where her mother used to lie. Eli stood in the doorway watching her breathe, thinking about how different this night could have ended, how close he'd come to not going at all. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Avery Sinclair. I wanted to thank you. Can we talk?" Eli stared at the message for a long moment before turning off his phone. Outside, Seattle slept on, unaware that the intersection of two lives had just shifted in ways that would ripple outward like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't ready to answer and complications he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Sophie was safe in her bed, and a woman who had shown him nothing but contempt was alive because he'd chosen to be better than her worst assumptions about him. Sometimes that had to be enough. The Seattle General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, a combination Eli remembered too well from Maria's final months. He stood outside Avery Sinclair's room holding a small potted plant, nothing fancy, just a resilient succulent from the grocery store that Sophie had insisted on picking out herself. "She almost died, Daddy," Sophie had said that morning, arranging her crayons with unusual precision. "Mama always said flowers help people feel better." So here he was, feeling foolish and out of place in the sterile corridor, questioning his decision with every step. 3 days had passed since the fire, and the media circus showed no signs of slowing down. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests, reporters camping outside their apartment building, neighbors suddenly very interested in conversations they'd never bothered with before. The visitor log at the nurse's station told a story of corporate obligation flowers from board members, fruit baskets from business partners, get-well cards from employees who probably feared for their jobs if they didn't send them. Eli's name looked out of place among the corporate signatures and executive titles. Room 314 was private, naturally, with a view of Elliott Bay that probably cost more per night than most people's mortgages. Avery sat propped against pillows, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of her usual perfect chignon. The burns on her hands were wrapped in white gauze, and her face showed the pallor of someone still recovering from smoke inhalation. She looked up when he knocked, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Mr. Ramirez," she said finally, her voice still rough around the edges. "I brought this from my daughter," Eli said, setting the small plant on her bedside table. "She wanted to make sure you were okay." Avery stared at the succulent as if it were an alien artifact. "Your daughter?" "Sophie. She's 9. She has a theory that plants help people heal faster." "And what's your theory, Mr. Ramirez?" The question caught him off guard. In the boardroom, she'd spoken to him like he was barely worth acknowledging. Now there was something different in her tone, not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful attention. "I think people heal when they're ready to," Eli said. "Sometimes they need help figuring out when that is." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Is that why you're here? To help me figure something out?" "I'm here because my daughter asked me to check on you. And because—" He paused, struggling with words. "Because what happened in that interview doesn't matter when someone's life is on the line." Avery was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity she'd shown in the boardroom, but without the predatory edge. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "You don't owe me anything. I was unnecessarily cruel during your interview. Unprofessional. I let my own frustrations cloud my judgment about your qualifications." Eli felt a flash of anger at the clinical language. Frustrations, judgment, as if his humiliation had been merely a minor miscalculation on her part. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why were you cruel? What did I do to deserve that?" Avery's fingers picked at the edge of her blanket, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with her usual composed demeanor. "You didn't do anything. That's not how it works." "Then how does it work?" She was quiet for so long that Eli began to wonder if she'd decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When you've spent your entire life proving you're worthy of respect, sometimes you forget that other people are fighting the same battle." The honesty in her words surprised him. This wasn't the ice-cold CEO who had dismissed his experience as manual labor. This was someone else entirely, someone who looked as lost as he'd felt walking out of that boardroom. "The news crews have been calling you a hero," Avery said, changing the subject. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed doing. Most people would have walked away. After how I treated you, most people would have felt justified in walking away." Eli thought about that moment outside the burning house, the brief temptation to let someone else handle the rescue. Maybe, but that's not who I want my daughter to think I am. Something shifted in Avery's expression, a softness he hadn't seen before. "Tell me about her, Sophie." For the next 20 minutes, Eli found himself sharing stories he rarely told about Sophie's artwork, her struggles with social situations, her unwavering belief that her father could fix anything, about the way she arranged her toys in perfect lines and how she needed exactly 4 minutes to transition between activities, about her laugh, which was bright and rare, and worth every sacrifice he'd made. Avery listened without interruption, asking occasional questions that showed she was really paying attention. When he mentioned Sophie's therapy schedule, she frowned. "That must be expensive." "We manage," Eli said, though they both knew it was only partly true. "The fire investigation is ongoing," Avery said after another pause. "But preliminary reports suggest it was electrical, old wiring in a house that was supposed to be state-of-the-art. Insurance will cover it? Eventually. But that's not the point." She looked out the window at the bay, where ferries moved like white insects across the grey water. "I've lived in that house for 8 years, and I'm not sure I knew a single one of my neighbors. I had the best security system money could buy, but when it mattered, none of that helped. What helped was a man I'd treated like garbage, choosing to run toward a burning building instead of away from it." The raw gratitude in her voice made Eli uncomfortable. He'd been raised to help people without expecting recognition, and the media attention felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. "I should let you rest," he said, standing. "Will you come back?" The question came out quickly, as if she'd surprised herself by asking. "If you want me to." "I do." Walking back through the hospital corridors, Eli tried to process what had just happened. The woman in that room bore little resemblance to the one who had humiliated him 3 days ago. Which one was real? Or were they both real, different facets of someone more complicated than he'd assumed? The lobby was filled with the usual hospital chaos, families in crisis, medical staff moving with purposeful urgency, the quiet desperation that hung over places where life and death decisions were made daily. Eli had spent too much time in hospitals over the past few years, first with Maria and then with Sophie's various appointments. His phone buzzed with yet another call from a reporter. He'd stopped answering them, but the voicemails kept coming. Someone wanted to do a feature story about everyday heroes. Someone else was producing a segment about unlikely rescues. They all wanted to fit his story into neat categories: working-class man saves wealthy CEO, former firefighter, can't resist the call to duty. None of them understood the complexity of standing in that hospital room, talking to a woman who had shown him cruelty and gratitude in equal measure. None of them would understand the guilt he felt about wanting to walk away, or the confusion he felt about her apology. The bus ride home gave him time to think, watching Seattle pass by in a blur of familiar landmarks. The Space Needle pointing toward grey clouds, Pike Place Market bustling with tourists and locals, the waterfront where he and Maria used to walk on Sunday afternoons when Sophie was small enough to carry on his shoulders. Mrs. Chen was waiting in their apartment with Sophie, helping her with homework at the kitchen table. They looked up when he entered, and Sophie immediately abandoned her math worksheet. "How is she?" Sophie asked, wrapping herself around his waist. "She's getting better. She wanted me to thank you for the plant." "Did she like it?" "She did. I think it made her feel less alone." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Eli sat at his laptop, scrolling through job listings with decreasing enthusiasm. The viral video of his rescue had generated hundreds of messages, some offering work, others just wanting to share their own stories of loss and heroism. Most of the job offers were clearly capitalizing on his moment of fame, temporary positions that would disappear as soon as the news cycle moved on. but buried among them was an email that made him pause. The sender was listed as A. Sinclair at sinclairtech.com, mail to A. Sinclair at sinclairtech.com, sent just 2 hours ago. Mr. Ramirez, it read, I've been thinking about our conversation today and about the work we discussed during your interview. I may have been too hasty in my initial assessment. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss a consulting position that might make better use of your expertise. The pay would be substantial and the schedule flexible enough to accommodate your daughter's needs. Please consider it. A.S. Eli read the message 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or conditions. Was this genuine, or was it guilt-motivated charity? Did it matter? Sophie's therapy schedule stared at him from the refrigerator, a grid of appointments they could barely afford. Tomorrow there would be more bills, more job rejections, more nights of wondering how long they could keep their heads above water. He thought about Avery's words. When you've spent your entire life proving you're worthy of respect, sometimes you forget that other people are fighting the same battle. Maybe they were both fighting battles the other couldn't see. Maybe this offer was a chance for both of them to prove something to her, to him, to the world that had tried to reduce them to simple categories. Eli closed his laptop and walked to Sophie's room, standing in the doorway watching her sleep. Her drawing of the hero daddy was still taped to the wall above her bed, the red helmet bright against the white paper. Tomorrow, he would call Avery Sinclair and find out what she really wanted from him. Tonight, he would try to believe that sometimes second chances came from the most unexpected places. The consulting contract arrived via courier the next morning, bound in expensive leather that probably cost more than Eli's monthly grocery budget. Sophie watched from the kitchen table as he spread the documents across their small dining area, her cereal growing soggy while she studied his face for clues about their future. "Is it good news, Daddy?" Eli scanned the terms, trying to hide his surprise at the numbers. 6 months of consulting work at a rate that would not only cover Sophie's therapy, but actually allow them to save money for the first time in 2 years. The scope of work was deliberately vague consultation on safety technology, development and implementation, but the compensation was crystal clear. "It might be, Mija. We'll see." The truth was more complicated. Accepting this offer meant working for the woman who had publicly humiliated him, entering a world where he'd always be the outsider who got lucky. But it also meant Sophie could continue her therapy. They could move to a larger apartment, maybe even start thinking about her college fund again. "Are you going to work with the lady you saved?" "Maybe. How would you feel about that?" Sophie considered this with the gravity that 9-year-olds brought to important decisions. "I think she probably learned something when you helped her. Mama always said people can change if they want to." Out of the mouths of babes. Maria had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of transformation, even in the most unlikely circumstances. It was one of the reasons she'd fallen in love with a firefighter who ran toward danger while others ran away. The Sinclair Technologies building looked different when Eli returned 3 days later, no longer an imposing fortress, but simply another workplace where people tried to solve problems and pay their bills. The security guard remembered him from the news coverage and waved him through with something approaching respect. Avery's office occupied a corner of the 45th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. She sat behind a glass desk that was meticulously organized, every document aligned with military precision. The burns on her hands were healing but still visible, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. "Mr. Ramirez, thank you for coming." She gestured to the sitting area near the windows, a more informal space with leather chairs and a coffee table that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. This was different from their last meeting, no power games, no positioning for psychological advantage. "I've reviewed the contract," Eli said, settling into one of the chairs. "The terms are generous. They're fair compensation for expertise we need." Avery poured coffee from a service that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I want to be clear about something from the start. This isn't charity. I'm not offering you this position because you saved my life." "Then why are you offering it?" "Because I was wrong about you. Your insights about our thermal imaging system were accurate. We've had field reports of exactly the problems you identified. Your solutions were practical and implementable. She paused, looking out at the city below. I let my assumptions about your background cloud, my judgment about your capabilities. Eli sipped his coffee, noting its perfect temperature and rich flavor. Everything in Avery's world was calibrated for excellence, from the expensive chairs to the precisely timed meetings. What exactly would I be doing? Our firefighter safety division has been underperforming. We design equipment for emergency responders, but most of our team has never actually used the gear in real situations. They understand the technology, but not the human factor. Show equipment behaves under stress, what modifications work in actual emergencies. She pulled out a tablet and showed him technical diagrams of breathing apparatus, communication devices, and thermal protection gear. We need someone who can bridge that gap. Someone who understands both the engineering principles and the practical realities. The designs were impressive, but clearly created by people who had never crawled through smoke-filled buildings or worked in extreme temperatures. Eli could see a dozen ways to improve them, modifications that would make the difference between equipment that looked good on paper and equipment that saved lives. The division is scheduled for review in 6 months. Avery continued. If we can't demonstrate significant improvement in field performance and user satisfaction, the board wants to shut it down and focus on more profitable sectors. And you don't want that to happen. Something flickered across her face, frustration perhaps, or disappointment. This company was built on safety innovation. My father started it because he believed technology could protect people, not just generate profits. That firefighter division represents something important. Something the board doesn't value? Something they don't understand the value of? Yet. Eli studied the diagrams more carefully, his mind already working through potential improvements. What kind of access would I have? To the design team, the manufacturing process, field testing? Complete access. Your recommendations would carry significant weight in the development process. Avery leaned forward slightly, and he caught a glimpse of something that might have been vulnerability. I'm not going to pretend this will be easy. Some people on the team might resist input from someone without traditional corporate credentials. You mean they might treat me the way you did in that interview? The words hung between them for a moment. Avery didn't flinch from the directness of his question. Yes, they might. And if they do, I'll address it immediately. What happened in that boardroom was unacceptable, and it won't happen again under my watch. There was steel in her voice now, the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But there was also something else, genuine regret, maybe even shame. I need to ask you something, Eli said. In that interview, you said I should find something more suitable to my skill set. What did you mean by that? Avery was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I meant that I was threatened by you. Threatened? By me? By what you represented. Someone who had actually done the work our equipment is designed to support. Someone who could expose the gaps between our assumptions and reality. She looked directly at him now. I spent 10 years proving I could run this company as well as any man, that my ideas were as valuable as anyone's with an MBA. When you walked into that room with your real-world experience and your practical insights, I felt like you were challenging everything I'd worked to establish. So you decided to tear me down before I could challenge you? Yes, and I was wrong. Your experience doesn't diminish my expertise, it could enhance it if I'm smart enough to listen. The honesty in her admission was unsettling. Eli had expected corporate speak, carefully crafted apologies designed to smooth over past conflicts. Instead, he was getting something raw, more personal. What about your team? Will they be as willing to listen? Some will. Others might need more convincing. Avery smiled for the first time since he'd entered the office, and it transformed her face entirely. But that's why we're structuring this as a consulting arrangement rather than permanent employment. You'll have the authority to make recommendations without getting tangled up in office politics. They spent the next hour going through the specifications schedule, would be flexible enough to accommodate Sophie's needs. His office would be located with the safety division team, and his first priority would be conducting field assessments of current equipment performance. "There's one more thing," Avery said as they prepared to conclude the meeting. "The media attention from the rescue is still significant. There may be photographers outside the building, reporters wanting to interview the hero consultant. How do you want to handle that?" Eli thought about the circus that had surrounded their apartment building, the way strangers felt entitled to comment on his choices and motivations. "I just want to do good work. The rest of it is noise." "Agreed. We'll have security escort you to the parking garage if needed." As they shook hands carefully, given her healing burns, Eli felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. Working here meant entering Avery's world, with all its complexities and contradictions. It meant trusting someone who had hurt him, betting that her apology was genuine and her commitment to change was real. "Mr. Ramirez," Avery called as he reached the door. "Thank you for the second chance. Thank you for offering it." The elevator ride down felt different from his previous trips in this building. 3 weeks ago, he'd descended these floors feeling diminished and defeated. Now he was descending as someone with purpose, with prospects, with the chance to make a real difference in work that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda Chen. "Sophie wants to know if you got the job. She's been asking every 5 minutes since you left." Eli smiled as he typed back, "Tell her Daddy got the job, and tell her we're going out for ice cream tonight to celebrate." The parking garage was indeed filled with news vans and photographers, just as Avery had predicted. Security guards formed a loose perimeter around his beat-up Honda, and camera flashes lit up the concrete space like lightning. Someone shouted questions about his new position, about whether he was being rewarded for his heroism. Eli ignored them all, focusing on the drive home and the conversation he would have with Sophie about new beginnings and second chances. About how sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply can also offer us the greatest opportunities for growth. By the time he reached their apartment building, he'd made peace with his decision. Tomorrow he would start a new job working for a woman who had publicly humiliated him. In 6 months, he would either help save a division that protected people's lives or watch it disappear into corporate restructuring. Either way, Sophie's therapy would continue, their bills would be paid, and he would have the chance to prove that practical experience and formal expertise could work together to create something better than either could achieve alone. That night, sharing ice cream sundaes at their tiny kitchen table while Sophie chatted about her day, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping at any lifeline, but the steady hope of someone who could see a path forward, even if that path led through uncertain territory. Change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The only question now was whether he could navigate it without losing sight of who he was and what mattered most. Eli's first day at Sinclair Technologies began with a hand-drawn blueprint spread across his new desk, sketched on the back of Sophie's homework from the night before. The design showed modifications to the standard breathing apparatus that could increase air efficiency by 15%, small changes based on 15 years of experience with equipment that had to work perfectly when people's lives depended on it. The safety division occupied half of the 38th floor, a space that felt caught between the corporate polish of the executive levels and the practical functionality of an actual engineering workspace. Workbenches lined the walls, scattered with prototypes and testing equipment, while rows of cubicles housed the design team responsible for creating gear that emergency responders used in the field. "So you're the famous hero consultant." Eli looked up to find a man in his mid-30s standing beside his desk, arms crossed in a posture that managed to be both casual and confrontational. His badge identified him as Marcus Webb, Senior Design Engineer. "I'm Eli Ramirez. And you are?" "The guy who's been designing firefighter safety equipment for 8 years while you were playing with hoses." Marcus picked up the hand-drawn blueprint, studying it with obvious skepticism. Interesting approach to technical documentation. The comment stung, partly because it echoed Avery's initial dismissal of his qualifications. But Eli had learned something in that hospital room about the difference between defensive anger and productive response. "It's a rough sketch of some modifications I've been thinking about," Eli said evenly. "I'd be happy to walk you through the reasoning behind them." "Oh, I'd love to hear this. Please, enlighten those of us with actual engineering degrees about how we've been doing everything wrong." Other members of the team had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation brewing at the new guy's desk. Eli recognized the dynamic. He'd seen it in fire stations when veteran firefighters tested new recruits, pushing to see if they'd crack under pressure or prove themselves worthy of respect. "The breathing apparatus modifications are based on field observations," Eli began, standing and pointing to specific elements of his sketch. "Current designs work well in laboratory conditions, but in actual structure fires, the air intake positioning creates problems when firefighters have to work in confined spaces or unusual angles. Problems that somehow escaped our extensive testing protocols. Testing protocols that simulate ideal conditions, not the chaos of real emergencies." Eli kept his voice calm, but let some authority creep in. "How many of your test scenarios involve crawling through spaces where the ceiling height is less than 3 feet, or working upside down to reach victims trapped under debris?" Marcus's confident expression flickered slightly. "We test for a wide range of scenarios." "Do you test with equipment that's been exposed to extreme heat for 40 minutes? With users who are exhausted, dehydrated, and making life or death decisions while their adrenaline is spiking?" Eli turned to address the growing crowd. "Because that's the reality of how this equipment gets used." A woman from the back of the group spoke up. "What kind of modifications are you suggesting?" Her badge identified her as Sarah Kim, and unlike Marcus, her interest seemed genuine rather than confrontational. Eli felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Repositioning the primary air intake by 2 inches and adding a secondary bypass valve for emergency situations," he said, sketching additional details on the blueprint. "It's a small change that would prevent equipment failure in exactly the kind of conditions where failure means death." Sarah nodded, studying the modifications with the intensity of someone who understood both the technical aspects and their practical implications. "Have you seen this specific failure in the field?" "3 times. Once it nearly cost me my partner's life when his equipment malfunctioned during a warehouse fire." Eli's voice carried the weight of memory. "We lost precious minutes getting him to safety when seconds counted." The room had grown quiet, the initial skepticism replaced by something closer to attention. These were people who designed equipment to save lives, and the reminder of what happened when that equipment failed hit home. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to concede ground. "Even if your observations are valid, implementing changes like this would require months of testing, regulatory approval, manufacturing retooling. We can't just redesign products based on anecdotal evidence." "I'm not suggesting we bypass proper testing," Eli replied. "I'm suggesting we test the right things. Your current protocols are excellent for verifying that equipment meets specifications. But are those specifications based on real-world usage patterns?" Before Marcus could respond, a familiar voice cut through the discussion. "How's the integration going?" Avery Sinclair stood at the edge of the group, having approached so quietly that no one had noticed her arrival. She was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but her focus was entirely on the blueprint spread across Eli's desk. "Mrs. Sinclair?" Marcus said, his confrontational tone immediately shifting to something more respectful. "We were just discussing Mr. Ramirez's suggestions for product modifications. And what's your assessment of those suggestions?" Eli watched the interaction with interest, noting how the team's dynamics shifted in Avery's presence. Marcus straightened slightly. Sarah stepped forward to get a better view of the conversation, and several other engineers moved closer, as if proximity to the CEO might somehow enhance their standing. "They're interesting ideas," Marcus said carefully, "but they would require significant resources to implement properly." Avery moved to the desk and studied Eli's hand-drawn blueprint, her green eyes taking in every detail with the same intensity she'd shown during his original interview. But this time, the scrutiny felt different, analytical rather than dismissive. "Walk me through this," she said to Eli. For the next 10 minutes, Eli explained his proposed modifications, using the rough sketch as a reference while drawing additional diagrams to illustrate specific points. Avery asked technical questions that demonstrated a deeper understanding of engineering principles than he'd expected, challenging his assumptions and pushing him to defend his reasoning. The rest of the team listened in silence, witnessing what felt like a high-stakes examination of both the new consultant's competence and their CEO's judgment in hiring him. The manufacturing changes would be minimal, Eli concluded. Most of the modifications involve repositioning existing components rather than creating new ones. The real challenge would be updating the testing protocols to reflect actual usage conditions. And you believe these changes would result in measurable performance improvements? I believe they would save lives. Whether that translates to measurable performance improvements depends on how you define performance. Avery smiled at that, an expression that seemed genuine rather than polite. Fair point. Sarah, I want you to work with Mr. Ramirez to develop a formal proposal for these modifications. Include cost estimates, implementation timeline, and a revised testing protocol that incorporates his field experience. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, making notes on her tablet. Marcus, I want you to review the proposal and provide a technical assessment of feasibility and potential manufacturing challenges. Marcus nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with the assignment. I want preliminary findings on my desk within 2 weeks, Avery continued. This is exactly the kind of practical innovation we need to keep this division relevant. As the group began to disperse, Avery lingered near Eli's desk. How was your first morning, aside from the welcoming committee? About what I expected. Change is always difficult, especially when it comes from outside the system. Marcus is a good engineer, but he's been here long enough to become protective of existing processes. Don't take his resistance personally. I didn't. I've dealt with skeptical colleagues before. Avery picked up his hand-drawn blueprint, examining it more closely. You drew this at home? Last night. Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table, and I started thinking about ways to improve the air intake design. She let me use the back of her math worksheet. Your daughter is involved in your work process? The question caught Eli off guard. He'd mentioned Sophie during their hospital conversation, but this felt like a different kind of inquiry, personal rather than professional. She's involved in everything I do. Single parenting doesn't allow for much separation between work and family. That must be challenging. It's worth it. Eli met her gaze directly. She's the reason I'm here, the reason any of this matters. Something shifted in Avery's expression, a flicker of emotion he couldn't quite identify. I'd like to meet her sometime, if that would be appropriate. The request surprised him. In his experience, corporate executives didn't express interest in employees' children unless it was part of some calculated public relations effort. But Avery's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. She'd like that. She's been asking about the lady I saved, wondering if you're feeling better. Tell her I'm feeling much better, thanks to her father. After Avery left, Eli spent the rest of the morning reviewing technical specifications and familiarizing himself with the division's current product line. The equipment was well designed and technologically advanced, but he could see Marcus's influence in the emphasis on engineering elegance over practical functionality. Sarah stopped by his desk around lunchtime, carrying a sandwich and a coffee that she set down beside his laptop. Peace offering, she said. Marcus isn't usually that confrontational. He's been under pressure lately. The division's performance reviews haven't been great, and he's worried about job security. I understand. Change threatens people's sense of stability. Still, he was out of line. Your modifications make sense from a field perspective. Sarah pulled up a chair, settling in for a longer conversation. Can I ask you something? What made you decide to take this job? After what happened in your interview, I mean. Eli considered how much to share. The full story involved Sophie's therapy costs and his desperation for stable income, details that felt too personal for a workplace conversation. Everyone deserves a second chance, he said finally. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who need our help the most. That's very generous. I'm not sure I'd be that forgiving. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about not letting their mistakes define your choices. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Miss Sinclair seems different since the fire. More, approachable, I guess. She's always been brilliant, but there was a distance before. Like she was afraid to show any vulnerability. Maybe nearly dying changes your perspective on what's important. Maybe. Or maybe having someone risk their life for you teaches you something about the value of human connection. They spent the lunch hour discussing technical aspects of the safety equipment, with Sarah providing insight into the division's history and culture, while Eli shared stories from his firefighting career that illustrated the real-world applications of their designs. By the end of the day, Eli felt cautiously optimistic about his new role. The work was challenging and meaningful, the potential for positive impact was significant, and despite Marcus's initial hostility, most of the team seemed genuinely interested in learning from his experience. The drive home took him through neighborhoods that represented different versions of the American dream, from the gleaming downtown towers where ambition was currency, to the working-class areas where people measured success in smaller increments. Sophie's school was located in a transitional zone between the two worlds, serving families who were climbing towards something better. She was waiting in the after-school program when he arrived, bent over a drawing that showed remarkable detail for a 9-year-old. The picture depicted a tall building with lots of windows and tiny figures moving around inside what appeared to be an office setting. "That's beautiful, Miha. What is it?" "It's where you work now. Mrs. Chen said you have an office in a really tall building, so I wanted to draw it for you." Eli studied the drawing more carefully, noting the care she'd taken with architectural details and the way she'd positioned the tiny figures to suggest purposeful activity rather than random movement. "It's perfect. I'll hang it in my office tomorrow." "Really, won't that be embarrassing?" "Why would it be embarrassing?" "Because it's just a kid's drawing, and you work with important people now." The comment hit him like a physical blow. Sophie had internalized the message that his world was divided into important people and everyone else, that her father's transition into corporate consulting somehow required leaving parts of himself behind. "Sophie, look at me." He knelt to her level, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "You are the most important person in my world. Your drawings, your ideas, your questions, they matter more than anything else I do. Never forget that." She nodded solemnly, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The transition to his new job was changing more than just their financial situation. It was shifting the balance of their carefully constructed life together. That evening, while Sophie worked on homework at the kitchen table, Eli reviewed the technical documents Sarah had given him and began sketching more detailed versions of his equipment modifications. The hand-drawn blueprint had served its purpose as a conversation starter, but formal proposals would require precision and professional presentation. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Avery's request to meet Sophie, trying to understand the motivation behind it. Was it genuine interest in his family, or corporate courtesy designed to strengthen their working relationship? Did it matter, as long as Sophie benefited from the interaction? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Sarah from work. I forgot to mention there's a team happy hour Friday at Murphy's Pub if you'd like to join. No pressure, but it might help with the integration process." Eli stared at the message, weighing the benefits of workplace socialization against the complexity of arranging childcare and the discomfort of being the outsider trying to fit in. He was still debating his response when Sophie looked up from her homework. "Daddy, are you going to be different now that you have a fancy job?" "What do you mean, different?" "Will you still make pancakes on Saturday mornings? Will you still read me stories before bed?" The questions revealed the heart of her anxiety about his new position. Change had brought loss before in her young life, first her mother's illness and death, then his unemployment and their financial struggles. Now, just as stability seemed within reach, she was worried about losing the constancy of their relationship. "I will always make you pancakes on Saturday mornings," Eli said, setting aside his work and moving to sit beside her. "I will always read you stories before bed. Nothing about my job will change the important things. Promise?" "I promise." But even as he made the commitment, Eli wondered if it was one he could keep. Corporate consulting required travel, evening meetings, weekend work sessions. The financial security was desperately needed, but it came with obligations that might strain the careful balance they'd maintained. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The only question was whether they could navigate it together, holding on to what mattered most while adapting to new realities that neither of them fully understood. 2 weeks into his new position, Eli discovered the childhood photograph hidden behind a stack of quarterly reports in Avery's office. He was there to deliver the formal proposal for equipment modifications, arriving early for their scheduled meeting when she stepped away to handle a crisis call from the manufacturing division. The photo was small and slightly faded, tucked between the pages of a budget analysis, as if someone had been reviewing it privately and forgotten to put it away. It showed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing alone in front of what appeared to be a boarding school. The child's auburn hair was pulled back in braids, her green eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was too serious for someone so young. "That's not supposed to be there." Eli looked up to find Avery in the doorway, her face carefully composed, but her eyes showing a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the folder. "I was just reviewing the documents, and it fell out." "No harm done." Avery moved to her desk and slipped the photo into a drawer with practiced efficiency. "Just an old picture I keep for sentimental reasons." She settled into her chair and gestured for him to sit, but the moment had shifted something between them. The glimpse of her childhood, self-isolated and vulnerable, added a dimension to their professional relationship that felt both intimate and uncomfortable. "The proposal looks comprehensive," Avery said, opening his formal documentation. "Sarah's technical assessment supports your field observations, and even Marcus has grudgingly admitted the modifications would address real performance gaps. That's progress. I wasn't sure he'd come around. Marcus is protective of his work, but he's not stupid. When presented with solid evidence, he can admit when he's wrong." Avery turned to a page filled with cost projections and implementation timelines. "The manufacturing changes are more extensive than I initially expected, but still manageable within existing production capabilities," Eli pointed out. "We're not talking about completely redesigning the equipment, just optimizing it for actual usage conditions. The board will want to see projected ROI on the development investment. How do you measure return on investment for equipment that saves lives?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "You measure it in market penetration, customer satisfaction scores, reduced warranty claims, competitive advantage. And if the equipment prevents one firefighter from dying in the line of duty, how do you quantify that?" Avery was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the cost analysis. "You don't, but unfortunately, that's not how corporate budgets work." "Maybe that's the problem." "Maybe it is, but I still have to work within the system to change it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sarah Kim entered with a tablet and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to see this immediately." She set the tablet on Avery's desk, showing a news article with the headline, "Local Heroes' Innovations Could Save Lives Nationwide." The article featured a photo of Eli working at his desk, apparently taken by someone with a telephoto lens from the building across the street. It described his consulting work at Sinclair Technologies and quoted anonymous sources within the company about his proposed equipment modifications. "How did they get this information?" Avery asked, her voice sharp with concern. "I don't know," Sarah replied. The article mentions specific details about the breathing apparatus, modifications, and the testing protocol changes. Someone with access to confidential project information must have leaked it. Eli felt a sinking sensation as he read through the article. The reporter had sensationalized his background, describing him as a working-class hero taking on corporate indifference, and suggesting that his innovations were being resisted by ivory tower engineers who've never faced real danger. "This makes it sound like there's conflict within the team," he said. "Like I'm some kind of crusader fighting against internal opposition." "Is there truth to that characterization?" Avery asked. There was initial skepticism, but nothing like what this article suggests. "Marcus and I have been working together productively." "The timing is problematic," Sarah added. "The board review of the safety division is next month. This kind of media attention could influence their decision-making process." Avery closed the tablet and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Media attention isn't necessarily negative. If the story positions us as a company that values practical innovation and real-world expertise, it could actually help our case. But if it creates the impression that we're divided internally, or that implementing these changes required outside pressure, it could undermine confidence in our leadership," Eli pointed out. "True, we need to control the narrative." Avery turned to Sarah. "Set up a meeting with the communications team. I want a response strategy that emphasizes our commitment to continuous improvement and collaborative innovation." After Sarah left, Avery and Eli sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. The article had changed the dynamics of their working relationship, transforming private collaboration into public scrutiny. "I need to ask you something," Avery said finally, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. Did you or anyone in your family provide information for this article?" The question stung, partly because it revealed her lingering doubts about his motivations, and partly because it forced him to confront his own feelings about the media attention surrounding his new position. "No. I've been avoiding reporters since the rescue. The last thing I want is more publicity." "Then how did they get specific details about proprietary modifications?" "Someone on the team must have talked to them, but I don't know who or why." Avery nodded, seeming to accept his answer. "This kind of leak suggests someone wants to create controversy around your role here. Any idea who might have that motivation?" Eli thought about Marcus's initial hostility, the skeptical looks from some team members, the comments about his lack of traditional credentials. But accusing colleagues without evidence felt both unprofessional and dangerous. "There are people who weren't thrilled about my hiring," he said carefully, "but that doesn't mean they'd sabotage the project. Maybe not intentionally, but corporate environments can bring out competitive instincts that lead to poor judgment." The conversation was interrupted by Eli's phone, buzzing with a text message from Linda Chen. "Sophie's school called. She's in the nurse's office, asking for you. Not sure what's wrong." "I need to go," Eli said, standing immediately. "Sophie's school, there's some kind of problem." "Of course. Take care of your daughter. We can finish this discussion later." The drive to Sophie's school took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Eli's mind raced through possibilities: injury, illness, another child being cruel about their circumstances. Sophie had been more anxious lately, asking repeated questions about whether his new job would change their life together. He found her in the nurse's office, sitting on a cot with her stuffed elephant clutched tightly in her arms. Her face was flushed, and she'd been crying, but she didn't appear to be physically hurt. "Daddy!" She launched herself into his arms, clinging with the desperate intensity of someone who had been genuinely scared. "What happened, Miha? Are you hurt?" "Some kids at lunch were talking about the news story," Sophie said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "They said you were famous and that we must be rich now, and when I said we weren't rich, they said I was lying." The school nurse, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had dealt with Sophie's occasional anxiety episodes before, provided context. "She became very upset during lunch and asked to call you. I thought it was best to have her wait in here until you could arrive." Eli carried Sophie to his car, buckling her seatbelt and waiting for her breathing to return to normal before attempting conversation. The anxiety attacks had become less frequent over the past year, but stress could still trigger them. "Tell me what the kids said," he prompted gently. "They said they saw your picture in the newspaper and that you work for a really important company now. When I told them we still live in the same apartment and I still go to the same therapy, they said I was making it up." Sophie wiped her nose with her sleeve. "Then Madison said maybe you don't love me enough to spend money on me, and I got really scared that she was right." The cruelty of children could be breathtaking sometimes. 9-year-olds didn't yet understand the complexities of financial responsibility or the difference between having a good job and being wealthy. They only understood that attention meant importance, and importance meant resources. "Sophie, look at me." Eli turned in his seat to face her directly. "I love you more than anything in the world. Every choice I make is about giving you the best life I can. The new job means we can pay for your therapy and maybe move to a bigger apartment, but it doesn't change what matters most." "But what if the kids are right? What if having more money makes you different?" The question revealed the heart of her anxiety. Change had brought loss before in her young life, first her mother's death, then the financial struggles that followed. Now she was grappling with the possibility that positive change might also carry hidden costs. "Remember what Mama used to say about people who had a lot of money?" Eli asked. Sophie thought for a moment. She said money makes people more of what they already are. If they're kind, it helps them be kinder. If they're mean, it makes them meaner. "That's right. And what kind of person am I?" "You're the kindest person I know." "Then what do you think having more money will do to me?" Sophie's face brightened slightly as she worked through the logic. "It will help you be even kinder?" "Exactly. It means I can take better care of you, help other people more, maybe even help the lady I saved figure out how to be kinder too." They stopped for ice cream on the way home, a tradition from the difficult months after Maria's death, when simple pleasures had been the only antidote to overwhelming grief. Sophie chose mint chocolate chip, her favorite, and shared her thoughts about the newspaper article and her classmates' reactions. "Mrs. Patterson said famous people have to deal with people saying things about them that aren't true," Sophie said, swinging her legs from the tall booth seat. "Is that what's happening to you?" "Something like that. Sometimes when people don't understand a situation, they make up stories to fill in the gaps. Like when I didn't understand why Mama got sick, and I made up the story that it was because I forgot to feed her flowers." The memory hit Eli like a punch to the chest. Sophie had been 6 when Maria was diagnosed, too young to understand cancer but old enough to notice her mother's increasing weakness. She'd developed elaborate theories about how she could help, bringing flowers from the neighbor's garden, drawing pictures to make Mama's insides pretty, offering her favorite foods to restore strength. Yes, like that. People need explanations for things, even when the real explanation is complicated or sad. "So the newspaper people don't really understand why you help people." "They understand that I help people. They just don't understand that it's not about being a hero, it's about being the kind of person you can be proud of." That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Eli sat at his laptop researching the reporter who had written the article. Jennifer Martinez was a local journalist who specialized in human interest stories, with a track record of finding local angles on national trends. Her previous articles included profiles of lottery winners, small business success stories, and community heroes. Nothing in her background suggested malicious intent, but the specific details about his project suggested someone had provided her with inside information. The question was whether that person had acted from genuine belief that the story needed to be told, or from less admirable motivations. His phone buzzed with a text message from Avery. "I know today was difficult. If you need to adjust your schedule to accommodate Sophie's needs, we can make that work. Your family comes first." The message surprised him with its thoughtfulness. The Avery Sinclair, who had humiliated him in that boardroom 3 weeks ago, wouldn't have considered the impact of corporate drama on an employee's child. But the woman who had texted him seemed to understand that professional and personal lives weren't easily separated. He typed back, Thank you. She's okay now, just overwhelmed by the attention. See you tomorrow. Within minutes, another message arrived. For what it's worth, the article positions you as exactly the kind of innovative thinker this company needs. Don't let the politics discourage you from doing important work. Eli stared at the message for a long time, trying to decode its subtext. Was Avery offering professional encouragement or something more personal? Did it matter, as long as the work itself remained meaningful? Tomorrow he would return to the office and face whatever reactions the article had generated among his colleagues. Some would probably view him with increased respect, others with suspicion or resentment. The media attention would add pressure to succeed, transforming his private efforts to improve safety equipment into a public test of his credibility. But tonight, Sophie was safe in her bed, her anxiety about change temporarily soothed by ice cream and reassurance. Her drawing of his office building was taped to the refrigerator next to her earlier artwork, a visual reminder of how their lives were evolving. Change was complicated, bringing opportunities and threats in equal measure. The only constant was his commitment to protecting what mattered most while adapting to circumstances he couldn't control. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they would face them together, one day at a time. The fire investigation report arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Avery's office by a grim-faced detective who requested that she review the findings immediately and in private. Eli was there for their weekly project meeting when Detective Rodriguez, from the Seattle Police Department's arson unit, spread the official documents across the conference table. Miss Sinclair, I need to inform you that the fire at your residence has been officially classified as arson, the detective said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who delivered bad news professionally. The evidence is conclusive. Avery's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. Arson. Someone deliberately set my house on fire. Yes, ma'am. The accelerant was gasoline, applied to multiple ignition points throughout the lower level. The perpetrator knew enough about fire behavior to ensure rapid spread through the structure. Detective Rodriguez opened a file folder containing photographs and technical analysis. This wasn't random vandalism or amateur hour. Someone wanted that house to burn completely. Eli felt the world shift around him as the implications hit home. He'd saved Avery from a burning building, but what he'd actually done was prevent a murder. Someone had tried to kill her, and his intervention had unknowingly foiled their plan. Do you have any suspects? Avery asked, her business executive composure intact despite the personal nature of the threat. We're investigating several possibilities. The timing is significant. The fire occurred just 3 days after your interview with Mr. Ramirez here became public knowledge. Someone may have been waiting for the right moment when you'd be alone and vulnerable. The interview became public knowledge, Eli interrupted. How? Detective Rodriguez consulted his notes. Security footage from your building lobby was obtained by a local blogger who specializes in corporate executive tracking. He posted about the mystery meeting between you and the famous CEO, speculating about potential business deals. The post included your home address, drawn from public property records. The casual invasion of privacy was stunning. Some stranger with a camera had turned a private meeting into public spectacle, inadvertently providing information that someone had used to plan attempted murder. Have there been other threats against you? The detective continued. Disgruntled employees, business rivals, personal conflicts? Avery was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the investigation report. Running a large corporation creates enemies. Layoffs, contract disputes, competitive decisions that hurt other companies, but nothing that seemed to rise to the level of violence. We'll need a complete list of potential adversaries, recent and historical, business and personal. Detective Rodriguez handed her a card. In the meantime, I strongly recommend enhanced security measures. Whoever did this didn't expect you to survive, and they may try again when they realize you're still alive. After the detective left, Eli and Avery sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling between them like smoke. Everything about their relationship had been reframed by this new information. His rescue hadn't been a spontaneous act of heroism, it had been the accidental prevention of premeditated murder. "I need to ask you something," Avery said finally, "and I need complete honesty." "Okay. The timing of your presence at the fire scene, was it really coincidence?" The question hit him like cold water. "You think I was involved?" "I think someone tried to kill me, and you happened to be there at exactly the right moment to prevent it. In my experience, coincidences that convenient are usually something else." Eli stood abruptly, anger flashing through him. "You think I set your house on fire so I could play hero and get a job? I think I need to consider all possibilities." "Then consider this possibility. I heard the emergency call on my scanner, recognized your address from the business articles I'd read, and drove over out of curiosity. When I saw someone moving around inside the burning building, I did what 15 years of training had taught me to do." Avery studied his face with the same intensity she'd shown during his original interview, looking for signs of deception or calculation. "The timing still bothers me. 3 days after our interview, when you knew you wouldn't get the job. When I knew you'd humiliated me in front of your team," Eli corrected. "When I was angry and hurt, and probably not thinking clearly about anything except how to explain to my daughter that her therapy might have to stop because I wasn't good enough for your company." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to break through her corporate skepticism. "I'm sorry. I had to ask." "No, you didn't. You chose to ask because it's easier to believe in conspiracy than coincidence. Easier to think I had ulterior motives than to accept that someone would risk their life for a person who treated them badly." Eli moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I wish I'd never driven to your house that night. I wish I'd stayed home with Sophie and let someone else deal with your emergency. Because this," he gestured at the investigation report, "this complicates everything. Where are you going?" "To think about whether I want to keep working for someone who suspects me of attempted murder." The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt endless. Eli's hands shook as he fumbled with his car keys, adrenaline and anger coursing through his system in equal measure. Avery's suspicion had transformed his act of heroism into something sordid and calculated, poisoning the satisfaction he'd felt about their professional collaboration. His phone buzzed with calls from reporters who had somehow learned about the arson investigation. The hero narrative was evolving into something more complex and sinister, mysterious circumstances, potential conspiracies, questions about timing and motivation that would fuel speculation for weeks. By the time he reached home, Eli had made a decision. He called Sarah Kim and arranged to meet her at a coffee shop near the office, somewhere they could talk privately, without corporate surveillance or professional obligations. "I heard about the investigation," Sarah said when they met an hour later. "It's all over the building. People are scared." "Scared of what?" "That whoever tried to kill Avery might target other executives, that the company is under some kind of coordinated attack." Sarah stirred her coffee absently. "There are also rumors that you're under suspicion. Avery thinks the timing of my rescue was too convenient to be coincidental." "And what do you think?" "I think someone tried to commit murder, and I accidentally prevented it. I think the fact that I was there at the right moment was pure chance, but chance that saved her life." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's what I think too. But I can understand her paranoia. She's been getting death threats for years." "Death threats?" "Not direct ones, but running a major corporation makes you a target for all kinds of unstable people. Environmental extremists angry about manufacturing practices, anti-technology activists, disgruntled investors, competitors who think she's too aggressive." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The security team has files on dozens of people who've made concerning statements about her. Why didn't she mention that to the detective?" "Because most of it is corporate intelligence rather than law enforcement evidence. Threats that are implicit rather than explicit, patterns of behavior that suggest potential violence without actually crossing legal lines." Eli thought about the investigation report, wondering what other secrets Avery's life contained. "Do you think she's in real danger?" I think someone already tried to kill her once. That suggests they're serious about wanting her dead. The conversation was interrupted by Eli's phone ringing. Avery's name appeared on the caller ID, and he debated whether to answer. "I owe you another apology," she said when he finally picked up. "My suspicion was unfair and insulting." "Yes, it was. I've been living with security threats for so long that I've forgotten how to trust anyone's motives. When the detective told me about the arson, my first instinct was to assume conspiracy rather than coincidence. And now I remember that you risked your life to save someone who had treated you terribly. That's not the action of someone with ulterior motives. That's the action of someone with integrity." Eli sighed, feeling some of his anger dissipate. "This changes everything, you know. If someone really is trying to kill you, working together puts me and Sophie at risk." "I know. And I'll understand if you want to resign, but I'm hoping you'll stay." "Why?" "Because I need people around me I can trust, and you've proven that I can trust you with my life." The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 weeks ago, she'd dismissed him as unsuitable for meaningful work. Now she was asking him to stay because his character had been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. "What about Sophie's safety?" Eli asked. "If someone is targeting you, they might target people close to you. We can arrange protection. The company has resources. I don't want my daughter living under armed guard because of my job." Avery was quiet for a moment. "Then what do you want?" "I want to finish the project we started. The safety equipment modifications could save lives, and that work matters more than office politics or personal drama. But I need your word that if the threats escalate, if there's any indication that Sophie might be at risk, I walk away with no questions asked." "You have my word." That evening, Eli explained the situation to Sophie in terms she could understand. Someone had hurt the lady he'd saved, and the police were trying to find out who. There might be extra security around for a while, but she was safe, and they would continue their normal routine. "Is the lady scared?" Sophie asked, arranging her stuffed animals in a protective circle around her elephant. "Probably. Wouldn't you be scared if someone tried to hurt you? But she has you to protect her now, like how you protect me." The simple faith in her voice was both touching and terrifying. Sophie saw the world in clear, moral categories. Good people protected others, bad people caused harm, and her father was unquestionably one of the good ones. She couldn't understand the complexities of corporate politics or the calculated nature of attempted murder. "I'm not a bodyguard, Mija. I'm just helping her company make better safety equipment. But you saved her from the fire. That makes you her protector now." The concept of protective responsibility resonated with something deep in Eli's firefighter training. When you saved someone's life, you became invested in their continued survival. It wasn't a conscious choice, it was an instinctive response that most emergency responders understood but rarely discussed. "Maybe," he admitted, "but my first job is always protecting you." The next morning brought news that complicated everything further. Detective Rodriguez called Eli directly, requesting a meeting to discuss his role in the investigation. "We've identified a person of interest," the detective said, when they met at the police station. "Someone with both motive and opportunity to target Miss Sinclair." "Who?" "Marcus Webb, the senior engineer in your division. Financial records show he's been under significant economic pressure: underwater mortgage, child support payments, credit card debt. He was also one of the strongest opponents to your hiring." Eli felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Marcus had been difficult and defensive, but attempted murder seemed like an impossible escalation from workplace friction. "What evidence connects him to the arson?" "Circumstantial but compelling. He has access to Miss Sinclair's personal information through company records. He knows her schedule and habits from years of working together. His financial situation gives him motive to eliminate her and potentially profit from the chaos that would follow her death. That's a pretty thin connection between workplace conflict and premeditated murder." "Maybe, but he also purchased gasoline using a credit card 2 days before the fire, despite driving an electric vehicle. When we interviewed him yesterday, he couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for the purchase." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd been working alongside someone who might have tried to commit murder, sharing technical insights and building professional relationships with a potential killer. Are you arresting him? Not yet. We need more evidence to make charges stick. But we wanted you to know, because you're working closely with him, and if he realizes we suspect him, he might become desperate. What does that mean for my safety, for my daughter's? It means you should be careful. If Webb is our perpetrator, you're the person who prevented his plan from succeeding. That makes you both a witness and an obstacle. Eli drove back to the office in a state of shock, trying to process the possibility that Marcus had attempted murder over a workplace disagreement. It seemed impossible, but then again, most people couldn't imagine the circumstances that drove someone to set fire to an occupied building. The safety division felt different when he returned, charged with tension he couldn't quite identify. People worked quietly at their desks, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. News of the arson investigation had clearly spread through the building, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Marcus was at his workstation, reviewing technical specifications with apparent normalcy. He looked up when Eli approached, offering a greeting that seemed forced but not obviously hostile. "Heard about the investigation," Marcus said. "Crazy stuff. Who do you think would want to hurt Avery?" The casual use of their CEO's first name struck Eli as odd. In all their previous interactions, Marcus had referred to her as Ms. Sinclair, or simply the boss. The sudden informality suggested either growing comfort or calculated deception. "I don't know," Eli replied carefully. "The police seemed to think it was someone with inside knowledge of her routines. That could be dozens of people. Everyone from her executive assistant to the building maintenance staff knows her schedule." "True, but not everyone has access to her home address and personal information." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eye-sweariness, perhaps, or recognition that he was being evaluated. "The police talked to everyone in the division yesterday. Pretty invasive questions about our relationship with Avery, our financial situations, our whereabouts during the fire. Standard investigation procedure, I imagine." "Yeah, probably. Still feels weird being treated like a suspect when you're just trying to do your job." The conversation felt like verbal chess, each comment carefully chosen to probe for information while revealing as little as possible. Eli found himself studying Marcus's body language, looking for signs of guilt or deception, wondering if he was sharing workspace with someone who had tried to commit murder. "The safety equipment project is moving forward," Eli said, changing the subject to something more concrete. "Avery wants to accelerate the timeline for the prototype testing." "Makes sense. Media attention on the division could help with funding approval." Marcus turned back to his computer screen. "I've been working on the manufacturing cost analysis you requested. Should have preliminary numbers by end of week." The normalcy of the conversation was surreal. They were discussing project timelines and budget analyses, while one of them might be a would-be killer and the other might be his next target. Eli spent the rest of the morning reviewing technical specifications and trying to maintain professional routine despite the paranoia growing in the back of his mind. Every interaction with Marcus felt loaded with subtext, every casual conversation potentially containing hidden threats or admissions of guilt. At lunch, Sarah found him in the building's small cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table and pushing food around his plate without eating. "You look like hell," she said, sitting down across from him. "Thanks. That's exactly what I was going for." "The police talked to you, didn't they? About Marcus?" Eli looked up sharply. "How did you know?" "Because they talked to me too. Asked about his financial situation, his reaction to your hiring, whether he'd made any concerning statements about Avery." Sarah lowered her voice. "I've been thinking about it all morning, and there were things I dismissed at the time that seem more significant now." "What kind of things?" "Comments about how the company would be better off without her. Complaints about her leadership style becoming increasingly personal rather than professional. A few weeks ago, he said something about how some problems could only be solved by removing the source entirely. That doesn't necessarily mean he was planning murder." No, but combined with the financial pressure and the timing of the fire, it creates a pattern. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. The thing is, I liked Marcus. He was a good engineer and a decent colleague, but people can reach breaking points where they do things that seem impossible to imagine. The afternoon passed slowly, with Eli hyper-aware of Marcus's presence and movements. When Marcus left early for a dentist appointment, Eli felt relief that was both profound and disturbing. The idea that a co-worker might be a potential killer had poisoned the workplace atmosphere in ways that would be difficult to recover from. That evening, as Eli helped Sophie with her homework, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop interfering or you'll regret it." The message was simple and direct, carrying the unmistakable tone of a threat. Eli immediately called Detective Rodriguez, who arranged for patrol units to drive by their apartment building throughout the night. "This confirms that whoever tried to kill Avery sees you as an obstacle," the detective said. "You prevented their plan once, and they're worried you might interfere again. What do I do?" "Be careful, vary your routines, stay alert to your surroundings, and consider whether the consulting job is worth the risk to you and your daughter." That night, Eli lay awake, listening to every sound in their apartment, building footsteps in the hallway, car doors slamming outside, the hum of the elevator moving between floors. Sophie slept peacefully in the bed they shared, her stuffed elephant clutched tightly in her arms, oblivious to the danger that might be circling their carefully constructed life. Someone had tried to commit murder and failed. Now they were threatening the person who had interfered with their plan. The heroic rescue that had seemed like the beginning of positive change in their lives had become the catalyst for something far more dangerous. Eli thought about Avery's offer of protection, about the resources her company could provide to keep them safe. But accepting that help would mean acknowledging that his simple act of helping someone in need had drawn them into a conflict with stakes he was only beginning to understand. The fire investigation report lay on his dresser, its clinical language describing accelerants and ignition patterns that added up to attempted murder. Someone had wanted Avery Sinclair dead badly enough to plan and execute arson. The question now was whether they wanted it badly enough to try again, and whether they were willing to hurt an innocent 9-year-old to eliminate the man who had prevented their first attempt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight Sophie was safe beside him, and that had to be enough to build on, one careful step at a time. The prototype safety device gleamed under the workshop lights, 6 months of collaboration distilled into a piece of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for emergency responders. Eli ran his fingers along the modified air intake system, feeling the satisfaction of work that mattered, even as threats continued to circle their lives, like predators waiting for weakness. "Final testing is scheduled for tomorrow," Sarah announced, consulting her tablet while standing beside the workbench. "The rooftop demonstration will be broadcast live to the board meeting, with representatives from 3 major fire departments observing remotely." "No pressure," Eli muttered, but he was smiling. Despite everything, the arson investigation, the ongoing threats, Marcus's sudden disappearance after being questioned by police, they had created something revolutionary. The breathing apparatus modifications, combined with enhanced communication systems and improved thermal protection, represented the kind of innovation that could transform emergency response. "The media coverage will be extensive," Avery added, joining them in the workshop. She moved with more confidence now, her burns healed and her natural authority restored, but Eli could see the wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before the fire. 3 network affiliates, 2 tech journals, and that documentary crew following your story. My story. The unemployed firefighter who became a corporate consultant and revolutionized safety equipment design. It's compelling television. Avery picked up one of the communication devices, testing its weight and balance. "The board is treating this as a make-or-break moment for the safety division. Success means expanded funding and national contracts. Failure means shutdown." The pressure was enormous, but Eli felt ready for it. The equipment had performed flawlessly in controlled testing, and the modifications addressed real problems he'd witnessed in the field. More importantly, the team had come together in ways that transcended their initial skepticism about his unconventional background. "Sophie wants to watch the demonstration," Eli said. "I told her it would probably be boring, but she insists her daddy's work is the most important thing happening in Seattle tomorrow." "She's not wrong," Sarah replied. "This could change how safety equipment is designed nationwide. Other manufacturers will either adopt similar modifications or lose market share to companies that do." The thought was both exciting and daunting. Eli had never imagined that his practical experience could influence an entire industry. But the early feedback from field testers had been overwhelmingly positive. Firefighters, paramedics, and rescue workers reported improved performance, reduced equipment failures, and enhanced safety margins in critical situations. "There's something else we need to discuss," Avery said, her tone becoming more serious. "Detective Rodriguez called this morning. They've arrested Marcus Webb in connection with the arson." Eli felt relief and sadness in equal measure. Relief that the threat had been neutralized, sadness that a colleague he'd worked alongside for months had been capable of attempted murder. What evidence convinced them to make the arrest? "Surveillance footage from a gas station near my house, showing him purchasing gasoline in containers, financial records indicating payments from a competitor who would benefit from our safety division's failure, and a search of his apartment that uncovered research about my personal routines and security arrangements." So it was corporate espionage that escalated to attempted murder? Apparently, the competitor wanted to eliminate our safety division and acquire our patents through bankruptcy proceedings. Marcus was supposed to sabotage the division from within, but when that didn't work fast enough, the plan evolved to something more drastic. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. He was willing to commit murder for money? He was facing foreclosure, divorce, and potential bankruptcy. People do desperate things when they feel trapped. Avery's voice carried a note of sympathy that surprised Eli. "That doesn't excuse attempted murder, but it helps explain how someone can rationalize the unthinkable." "What does this mean for tomorrow's demonstration?" Eli asked. "It means we proceed as planned, but with enhanced security. The threat to me was specific to Marcus and his employers, and with him in custody, the immediate danger has passed." The rest of the day was spent in final preparations, reviewing safety protocols, coordinating with the film crew, and running through contingency plans for every possible scenario. Eli found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from the humiliation of his first interview to the heroic rescue that had changed everything. That evening, he sat with Sophie at their kitchen table, helping her with homework while she chatted about the upcoming demonstration. She had drawn another picture for his office, this one showing stick figures in safety gear standing on top of a tall building, with a rainbow arcing overhead and the words, "My Daddy Saves People," written in careful block letters. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" she asked, looking up from her math worksheet. "A little, but good nervous, like before a big test when you've studied hard and know you're ready." "Will the lady you saved be there?" "Yes. She'll be watching from inside the building while I test the equipment on the roof." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "I think she's different now. In your stories about work, she sounds nicer than she did before." "People can change, Miha. Sometimes difficult experiences teach us important lessons about what matters most. Like how Mama's sickness taught us that time together is more important than having lots of money." The wisdom in her 9-year-old observation never failed to amaze him. Exactly like that. They spent the evening in comfortable, routine dinner, homework, story time, and the careful ritual of preparing for bed that had evolved since Maria's death. Sophie arranged her stuffed animals in protective formation around her pillow, kissed the framed photo of her mother goodnight, and settled into sleep with the trust of someone who believed tomorrow would bring good things. Eli lay awake longer, reviewing the demonstration procedures and thinking about the path that had led him here. 6 months ago, he'd been unemployed and desperate, facing the possibility that Sophie's therapy might have to stop. Now he was preparing to showcase innovations that could save lives nationwide, working for a company that valued his expertise and compensated him fairly for it. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. The anger and bitterness he'd carried after Maria's death had slowly given way to something more constructive. Purpose, maybe, or simply the satisfaction of meaningful work that honored her memory by helping others. His phone buzzed with a text from Avery. "Thank you for everything you've contributed to this project. Tomorrow is about celebrating what we've accomplished together." He typed back, "Thank you for the second chance. See you on the rooftop." The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp Seattle sky that made the city's skyline look like something from a postcard. Eli arrived at the office early, before the media crews and board members, to run through final equipment checks and review safety protocols one more time. The rooftop of the Sinclair Technologies building offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, with the Olympic Mountains visible in the distance and ferries moving like white insects across the grey water. It was beautiful and appropriate testing safety equipment, designed to protect people's lives against a backdrop that reminded you why those lives were worth protecting. "Ready for your close-up?" Sarah asked, joining him near the equipment station they'd set up for the demonstration. Ready to prove that practical experience and engineering innovation can work together to create something better than either could achieve alone. That's a pretty good soundbite. The documentary crew will love it. As the morning progressed, the rooftop filled with cameras, observers, and technicians preparing for the live broadcast. Board members watched from the climate-controlled comfort of the conference room 45 floors below, while fire department representatives participated via video link from stations across the country. Avery appeared at his side as final preparations were completed, her professional composure intact, but her eyes showing the anticipation and nervousness that came with high-stakes demonstrations. "Any last-minute concerns?" she asked. "Just the usual pre-performance jitters. The equipment works, I've tested it dozens of times. Now it's about proving that under pressure, with cameras rolling and careers on the line. You've faced much higher pressure than this. Burning buildings, people's lives hanging in the balance. This is just business. This is about proving that the person you rescued from that fire was worth saving. That the work we've done together matters enough to change an entire industry." Avery looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "You already proved that, Eli. The moment you decided to run toward the flames instead of away from them." The use of his first name startled him in. All their months of working together, she'd maintained the formal distance of professional titles. This felt different, more personal, as if the shared experience of threat and collaboration had created something beyond workplace courtesy. 5 minutes to broadcast, the production assistant announced, and the rooftop activity intensified around them. Eli looked out over the city spread below, thinking about Sophie watching from her school, about the firefighters who would benefit from their innovations, about the path that had led from unemployment and humiliation to this moment of professional triumph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but today, on this rooftop, with cameras rolling and the world watching, he would demonstrate that sometimes the most valuable innovations come from understanding the human cost of failure and the practical requirements of success. The countdown began, and Eli stepped toward the equipment that would either validate months of work or expose the limitations of their collaboration. Either way, he was ready to show the world what happened when different kinds of expertise came together in service of something larger than individual ambition. The demonstration was about to begin. The live broadcast began with Eli standing 45 stories above Seattle, strapped into the modified safety equipment, while cameras captured every detail of the demonstration. The rooftop wind whipped around him, but the gear held steady, its improved design, handling the environmental challenges exactly as he'd predicted during months of development. This is Channel 7 News, with a special report on revolutionary safety innovations at Sinclair Technologies, the reporter announced from her position near the equipment station. Former firefighter Eli Ramirez is about to demonstrate new breathing apparatus and communication systems that could transform emergency response nationwide. Through the glass walls of the conference room below, Eli could see the board members leaning forward in their seats, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly curious. Avery stood at the front of the room, a wireless microphone clipped to her suit jacket, ready to provide technical commentary as the demonstration progressed. The modifications we're testing today address critical failures that emergency responders face in real-world conditions. Avery's voice came through his earpiece, clear and confident despite the stakes. Mr. Ramirez has 15 years of field experience that informed every aspect of this design process. Eli activated the breathing apparatus, feeling the familiar sensation of filtered air flowing through the improved intake system. The modifications were subtle but significant tree-positioned valves that prevented contamination, enhanced airflow that reduced fatigue, emergency bypass systems that could mean the difference between life and death in equipment failure scenarios. The first test involves extended operation under simulated stress conditions, he announced, his voice transmitted clearly through the enhanced communication system to observers watching from locations across the country. In traditional equipment, prolonged use at extreme angles often causes intake valve malfunction. He moved through a series of positions that replicated the challenging conditions firefighters faced in actual emergencies, crawling, climbing, working upside down, maintaining equipment function while simulating the physical stress of rescue operations. The cameras followed his movements, capturing both the technical aspects of the equipment and the human elements of emergency response work. Airflow remains consistent across all positions, he reported, monitoring the digital readouts that showed performance metrics in real time. No contamination alerts, no pressure variations, no system warnings. From the conference room, Avery provided context for the demonstration. Traditional breathing apparatus experiences a 15% efficiency loss when used at extreme angles for more than 20 minutes. Mr. Ramirez's modifications have eliminated that performance degradation entirely. The next phase of testing involved the communication systems designed to function reliably in the high-noise, high-stress environments where emergency responders operated. Eli activated simulated emergency scenarios building, collapse sounds, equipment alarms, radio interference, while maintaining clear communication with multiple receivers. Communication clarity at 97%, despite simulated environmental interference. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece from the technical monitoring station. Previous generation equipment would have dropped to less than 60% clarity under these conditions. Board member Dr. Patricia Hawkins spoke from the conference room, her voice transmitted to the rooftop demonstration area. Mr. Ramirez, can you explain how these modifications would have changed outcomes in emergencies you've personally experienced? The question was both technical and deeply personal, asking him to connect the innovation they were demonstrating to the real-world consequences of equipment failure. Eli paused for a moment, thinking about fires where communication breakdowns had nearly cost lives, rescues where breathing apparatus malfunctions had forced early evacuation. 3 years ago, my partner and I responded to a warehouse fire where toxic chemical storage created extreme contamination risks, he said, his voice carrying across the rooftop and into homes and fire stations nationwide. His breathing apparatus failed after 18 minutes because the intake valves couldn't handle the angle required to reach victims trapped in basement storage areas. The rooftop fell silent except for the sound of wind and camera equipment. We lost precious time getting him to safety, time that could have meant the difference between life and death for the people we were trying to rescue. The modifications we're testing today would have prevented that equipment failure entirely. And the victims? Dr. Hawkins asked quietly. We got them out, but it was closer than it should have been, and closer than it would be with equipment that works reliably under real-world conditions. The emotional weight of his response seemed to resonate through the conference room. Board members who had been evaluating the demonstration as a business proposition were now confronting the human cost of equipment limitations and the potential impact of the innovations they were considering. Avery's voice came through the broadcast system, strong and clear. This is why practical experience matters in product development. Engineering excellence means nothing if it doesn't translate to reliable performance when people's lives depend on it. The final phase of testing involved thermal protection, with Eli exposing the equipment to controlled heat sources that simulated the extreme temperatures emergency responders faced in fire situations. The modified gear not only maintained functionality, but actually improved performance as temperatures increased, exactly opposite to the degradation patterns of traditional equipment. Temperature resistance exceeds design specifications by 22%, he reported, monitoring the sensor readings while moving through simulated fire approach scenarios. Heat distribution systems are preventing the hotspots that typically cause equipment failure in extreme temperature environments. From fire stations across the country, radio calls came in with questions and observations from active emergency responders who were watching the demonstration. Their engagement was immediate and enthusiastic. These were people who understood exactly what the improvements meant in practical terms. Seattle Station 19 to demonstration team, came a familiar voice through the communication system. Chief Martinez here. How does the weight distribution compare to standard equipment during extended operations? Eli smiled, recognizing his former supervisor's voice. Chief, the redistributed components actually reduce fatigue during extended operations. The center of gravity modifications make the equipment feel lighter, even though total weight is essentially unchanged. Outstanding. When can we get these modifications implemented in our equipment inventory? That depends on today's board decision and subsequent manufacturing authorization, Avery responded from the conference room. But if approved, we could begin limited production within 60 days. The enthusiasm from working firefighters was palpable, transmitted through radio communications and video links that connected the corporate demonstration to the people who would actually use the equipment. Their validation carried more weight than any technical analysis or financial projection. As the demonstration moved toward its conclusion, Eli felt the satisfaction of work completed successfully under pressure. The equipment had performed flawlessly, the modifications had proved their worth, and the collaboration between practical experience and engineering innovation had created something genuinely valuable. Final systems check shows all equipment operating at optimal performance after 90 minutes of stress testing, he announced to the cameras and the nationwide audience. No failures, no degradation, no safety concerns. The rooftop filled with applause from the production crew and observers, while similar sounds came through the communication links from fire stations and emergency response centers across the country. In the conference room below, board members were engaged in animated discussion, their earlier skepticism replaced by obvious interest. But for Eli, the most important validation came through a text message on his personal phone from Linda Chen. Sophie is watching at school and she's so proud she's crying happy tears. You did it, Hero Daddy. As the cameras continued rolling and the media crew conducted interviews, Eli looked out over Seattle's skyline and felt the weight of accomplishment. They had created something that would save lives, proven that different types of expertise could work together productively, and demonstrated that second chances could lead to extraordinary outcomes. The demonstration was complete, but the real test was just beginning. Now the board would decide whether to embrace innovation or retreat to safer, more traditional approaches. Either way, Eli knew they had created something remarkable together. The board deliberation lasted 47 minutes, while Eli and the production crew waited on the rooftop, and millions of viewers watched the live coverage continue with expert commentary and field interviews. When the conference room doors finally opened, Avery emerged with an expression that revealed nothing about the outcome. She walked to the rooftop access door with the measured pace of someone who had spent years delivering both good news and devastating setbacks to people whose careers hung in the balance. The cameras followed her movement, capturing every nuance of what had become a pivotal moment not just for the safety division, but for the entire philosophy of how innovation should be approached in corporate environments. "The board has reached a unanimous decision," Avery announced, her voice carrying clearly across the rooftop and into the broadcast equipment. "The safety division modifications demonstrated by Mr. Ramirez will be implemented immediately with full production authorization and expanded development funding." The rooftop erupted in celebration. Sarah threw her arms around Eli in a spontaneous hug, while the production crew captured reactions from fire departments across the country, whose radio communications filled the air with cheers and congratulations. After months of uncertainty and threat, the work had been validated in the most public way possible. "Furthermore," Avery continued, raising her voice above the celebration, "the board has approved the creation of a new position, Director of Field Integration, to ensure that all future product development incorporates real-world experience alongside engineering expertise." She looked directly at Eli. "Mr. Ramirez, if you're interested, the position is yours." The offer came as a complete surprise. Eli had expected continued consulting work, but the creation of a permanent executive position represented something far more significant: recognition that his approach to innovation was valuable enough to institutionalize within the company structure. "I'm honored," he said, his voice carrying across the broadcast to audiences who had followed his journey from unemployed firefighter to corporate executive. "And I accept." The cheers from the rooftop were echoed by radio calls from fire stations nationwide, creating a moment of shared celebration that transcended the usual boundaries between corporate success and public service. For once, business innovation and practical benefit had aligned perfectly. As the official demonstration concluded and the media crews began packing equipment, Eli found himself alone with Avery near the rooftop edge, looking out over the city that had become the backdrop for both their personal and professional transformation. "You realize what you've committed to," she said, her tone lighter than he'd heard it in months. "Executive meetings, budget presentations, quarterly reviews, all the corporate bureaucracy you've been avoiding." "I realize I've committed to making sure good ideas don't get lost in corporate bureaucracy," he replied, "to ensuring that the people who actually use our equipment have a voice in how it's designed." "That's a diplomatic answer, but what I really want to know is whether you can forgive me for how this all started." The question brought them back to the beginning, the humiliating interview, her casual dismissal of his qualifications, the cruelty that had seemed so personal at the time. 6 months later, it felt like something that had happened to different people living different lives. "I forgave you the night you were lying in that hospital bed, asking about Sophie's plant," Eli said. "Everything since then has just been working toward this moment. Even the arson investigation, the threats, finding out that someone tried to kill me over corporate politics. Especially that, because it showed both of us what really matters when everything else gets stripped away." Avery was quiet for a moment, watching ferries move across Elliott Bay like white birds against the grey water. "I've been thinking about something Sophie said when I met her last week. She told me that her mother always said people show their true character when they think no one important is watching. That sounds like Maria. She said her father always acts like everyone is important, which is why he ran into a burning building to save someone who had been cruel to him." Avery turned to face him directly. "I want you to know that I see that now, and I want to be worthy of the risk you took." The admission carried weight beyond professional courtesy. It was personal acknowledgement of the transformation they had both undergone her, from corporate ice queen to someone capable of genuine gratitude, him from bitter, unemployed firefighter to someone building something meaningful from the ashes of disappointment. "You already are," Eli said simply. The moment was interrupted by Sarah's approach, carrying her tablet and wearing the expression of someone with urgent news to share. "The preliminary response numbers are incredible," she said, showing them real-time data from the broadcast coverage. 12 million viewers nationwide, with engagement rates higher than any corporate demonstration in recent history. More importantly, we're getting implementation requests from fire departments in 43 states. Implementation requests? They want to purchase the modified equipment immediately, not next quarter, not after additional testing now. The pre-orders based on today's demonstration could fund the entire production expansion. The numbers were staggering, representing validation that went far beyond board approval or media coverage. Emergency responders across the country had watched the demonstration and decided they needed the equipment immediately, willing to commit budget resources based on what they had seen. There's more, Sarah continued. The Department of Homeland Security wants to discuss integrating the modifications into federal emergency response standards. And 3 international corporations have inquired about licensing agreements for overseas production. Eli felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they had accomplished. A simple idea about improving breathing apparatus positioning had evolved into something that could influence emergency response protocols worldwide. As they prepared to leave the rooftop, Avery pulled him aside for a private conversation, away from the cameras and remaining crew members. "I have something for you," she said, producing a small wrapped package from her jacket pocket. "A thank you gift, from someone whose life you saved, to someone who gave her a second chance to deserve it." Inside the package was a photograph knot, the hidden childhood picture he'd glimpsed in her office, but a new one taken during the rooftop demonstration. It showed him in the safety equipment, focused and competent, with the Seattle skyline stretching behind him. But what made the picture special was the inscription on the back, written in Avery's careful handwriting. "To Elihu proved that heroes aren't born. They're forged through choices made when no one would blame them for walking away." "Thank you," he said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you for not walking away." The elevator ride down from the rooftop felt like a descent from mountain peaks back to ordinary life, but Eli knew that nothing about their life would be ordinary anymore. Sophie's therapy would continue without financial stress. They could move to a larger apartment, maybe even start thinking about college savings again. More importantly, he had found work that mattered, colleagues who respected his contributions, and a sense of purpose that honored Maria's memory while building something positive for Sophie's future. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, they were greeted by a crowd of Sinclair Technologies employees who had watched the demonstration on monitors throughout the building. The spontaneous applause was warm and genuine, coming from people who understood that today's success reflected well on the entire organization. "Speech!" someone called from the back of the crowd, and others picked up the chant. Eli looked at Avery, who nodded encouragingly. He stepped forward, still wearing the modified safety equipment that had performed so flawlessly during the demonstration. "6 months ago, I walked into this building as someone who desperately needed a job," he began, his voice carrying across the lobby. "I was angry, hurt, and convinced that my experience didn't matter in a world that seemed to value credentials over competence." The crowd listened with the attention that came from witnessing genuine transformation. "Today, I'm leaving this building as someone who's learned that the best innovations come from bringing different perspectives together. From understanding that practical experience and engineering expertise aren't competing philosophies, they're complementary strengths that create something better than either could achieve alone." He paused, looking at faces that had become familiar over months of collaboration and challenge. What we accomplished today wasn't just about improving safety equipment. It was about proving that second chances matter, that people can change, and that the most valuable work comes from helping others succeed rather than protecting our own territory. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, coming from people who had witnessed not just a successful product demonstration, but a fundamental shift in how innovation could be approached. As the crowd dispersed and normal business operations resumed, Eli walked to the parking garage with Avery and Sarah, processing the magnitude of what had changed in a single afternoon. The consulting contract had evolved into executive leadership, the safety equipment modifications had gained national recognition, and the professional relationship that had begun with humiliation had become something approaching friendship. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they reached their cars. Now we start the real work, Avery replied. Scaling production, training implementation teams, working with fire departments to customize installations. The demonstration was just the beginning. And personally, Sarah looked between them with the curiosity of someone who had observed their relationship evolve over months of collaboration. Eli thought about Sophie waiting at school, probably bouncing with excitement about the television coverage she'd watched. About the new apartment they could afford, the financial security that would allow him to focus on meaningful work rather than desperate survival. Personally, I'm going to pick up my daughter and take her out for the biggest ice cream sundae Seattle has to offer, he said, because she's been patient with all the changes in our life, and she deserves to celebrate too. Sounds perfect, Avery said, and Monday we start changing how safety equipment gets designed and manufactured nationwide. As they parted ways in the parking garage, Eli felt the satisfaction of work completed and challenges overcome. The man who had driven away from this building 6 months ago, angry, humiliated, and desperate, bore little resemblance to the person leaving today with executive responsibility and national recognition. But the most important transformation wasn't professional. It was the restoration of hope, the return of purpose, and the knowledge that Sophie would grow up seeing her father as someone who had turned disappointment into triumph through persistence and integrity. The drive to Sophie's school took him through neighborhoods that represented different versions of success. From downtown towers, where ambition was currency, to working-class areas where people measured progress in smaller increments. Now he belonged to both worlds, bridging the gap between practical experience and corporate innovation. Sophie was waiting with barely contained excitement when he arrived at the school, her backpack clutched in one hand and a drawing in the other. This latest artwork showed a figure in safety equipment standing on top of a tall building, with crowds of people cheering below and the words, "My Daddy the Director," written in careful block letters. "Mrs. Chen told me about your new job," she said, launching herself into his arms. "Does this mean we're rich now?" "It means we're secure now," Eli corrected gently. "It means your therapy will continue, we can move to a bigger apartment, and Daddy has work that helps people stay safe. Like how you helped the lady. Like how we helped each other." As they drove toward the ice cream shop that had become their tradition for celebrating important moments, Sophie chattered about the television coverage she'd watched at school and her plans for redecorating their new apartment. Her excitement was infectious, reminding him that the best victories were those that could be shared with the people who mattered most. The ice cream shop was crowded with after-school families, creating the kind of cheerful chaos that Sophie thrived in. They found a corner booth where she could spread out her drawings while demolishing a sundae that was architecturally ambitious and nutritionally questionable. "Are you happy, Daddy?" she asked between bites of mint chocolate chip and hot fudge. The question was simple but profound, cutting to the heart of everything that had changed since that humiliating interview 6 months ago. "I'm very happy, Mija, and I think Mama would be proud of both of us." Sophie nodded solemnly, considering this with the gravity that 9-year-olds brought to discussions about their departed parent. "I think she would like the lady you saved. She always said mean people usually just need someone to show them how to be kind." The wisdom in her observation never failed to amaze him. Maria had possessed that same ability to see potential for goodness in people others had written off, to believe in transformation, even when evidence suggested cynicism was more realistic. "I think you're right," Eli said, "and I think she'd be proud that we didn't give up when things got difficult." They finished their ice cream and drove home through the early evening traffic, past the Sinclair Technologies building, where tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and challenges. But tonight was for family celebration, for appreciating how far they had come, and looking forward to possibilities that seemed limitless. The transformation was complete, not just professional success, but personal healing and the restoration of hope that had seemed impossible during the darkest months after Maria's death. They had survived loss, overcome humiliation, and built something meaningful from the wreckage of their former life. Tomorrow would bring the work of implementing changes on a national scale, of proving that today's success wasn't just a moment of inspiration, but the beginning of sustained innovation. But tonight, Sophie was drawing pictures of their bright future, while Eli prepared dinner in their small kitchen, both of them secure in the knowledge that they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger together. 1 year later, Eli stood in the conference room of his new office, larger than his first apartment, with windows overlooking Elliott Bay and a view that never failed to remind him how far they had traveled. The walls were decorated with commendations from fire departments nationwide, technical patents bearing his name, and Sophie's artwork that had evolved from stick figures to sophisticated drawings, reflecting her growing understanding of her father's work. The family photo sat prominently on his desk, not just him and Sophie anymore, but the three of them together at the company picnic, where Avery had spent an entire afternoon teaching Sophie how to skip stones, while Eli manned the barbecue grill. It wasn't a traditional family portrait, but it captured something real about how their lives had become intertwined through circumstances none of them could have predicted. "The quarterly safety reports are in," Sarah announced, entering with her usual armload of tablets and documents. "Equipment failure rates are down 63% in departments using our modifications. Response time improvements, average 8 minutes per call. And the cost savings from reduced equipment replacement are exceeding all projections." More importantly, Eli said, reviewing the statistics that represented real-world impact, "How many lives have the improvements saved?" That's harder to quantify, but incident reports suggest at least 47 cases where the modified equipment prevented equipment failure that could have been fatal. And that's just in the first year of implementation. 47 lives. Eli thought about the families who didn't have to experience the devastation he and Sophie had faced, the children who wouldn't grow up without parents because safety equipment had worked when it mattered most. That was the real measure of success, not corporate profits or industry recognition, but people going home safely to the people who loved them. The intercom buzzed with Avery's voice. "Eli, can you join me in my office? There's something I want to discuss." He found her standing by the windows of her corner office, looking out at the city that had become the backdrop for all their transformations. She was dressed in her usual tailored perfection, but something about her posture suggested this wasn't a typical business meeting. "The board met yesterday to discuss the safety division's performance," she said without turning around. And they want to expand the field integration model to every division in the company. Engineering, manufacturing, customer service, research, and development. They want practical experience informing every aspect of our operations. The scope of what she was describing was staggering. What had begun as consulting work on breathing apparatus, modifications had evolved into a fundamental shift in corporate philosophy, prioritizing real-world application alongside theoretical expertise. That's a massive undertaking. It would require restructuring the entire organization. Yes, it would, which is why they want you to lead the transformation. Avery turned to face him, her expression serious but not unpleasant. "They're offering you the position of Chief Innovation Officer with a mandate to implement field integration across all company operations." The offer was both exciting and daunting. It represented recognition that his approach to innovation had value beyond the safety division, but it also meant responsibility for changing an entire corporate culture. What about Sophie? The position would require more travel, longer hours, greater pressure. The position would also provide resources to ensure Sophie has everything she needs: the best schools, comprehensive support services, college funding that would make her future secure, regardless of what happens. Avery paused, choosing her words carefully. And it would allow her to grow up seeing her father as someone who changed how an entire industry approaches innovation. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But I hope you'll consider that some opportunities come once in a lifetime, and this is one of them." That evening, Eli discussed the offer with Sophie over dinner in their new apartment, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a kitchen large enough for her to spread out her homework while he cooked. The space felt enormous compared to their previous place, but Sophie had made it home with her characteristic attention to organization and detail. "Would you still have time to make pancakes on Saturday mornings?" she asked, the same question she'd posed a year ago when everything had been uncertain. "I would make time for pancakes every Saturday morning for the rest of your life," Eli assured her. But the new job would mean some changes, more business trips, more evening meetings, more responsibility. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to important decisions. At 10 years old, she was more mature than many adults, shaped by loss and challenge into someone who understood that growth required adaptation. Would it help more people stay safe? Yes, it would help more people stay safe. Then I think you should do it. Mama always said helping people was more important than being comfortable. Her wisdom never failed to amaze him. Maria had indeed believed that meaningful work required sacrifice, that the best choices weren't always the easiest ones, and that purpose mattered more than convenience. "There's something else," Eli said, pulling out the second piece of news he'd received that day. "Avery asked if we'd like to join her for Thanksgiving dinner. She doesn't have family nearby, and she thought it might be nice to spend the holiday together." Sophie's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Really? She wants to have Thanksgiving with us?" "She said she can't cook to save her life, but she knows a great restaurant that does traditional dinners. She also mentioned something about teaching you how to build electronic circuits, if you're interested." "Electronic circuits? Like for building robots?" "Something like that." The excitement in Sophie's voice was unmistakable. Over the past year, her relationship with Avery had evolved from curiosity to genuine affection, built through weekend outings, science project assistance, and the kind of attention that Sophie had been missing since her mother's death. "Does this mean she's going to be like family?" The question was direct and complicated, touching on emotions and relationships that Eli hadn't fully processed himself. What did it mean that Avery had become such an integral part of their lives? That Sophie looked forward to her visits and asked about her when she traveled? That their professional collaboration had evolved into something that looked very much like chosen family? "I think it means she's someone important to both of us," Eli said carefully. "Someone we care about and who cares about us." "Good. I like having important people in our life again." Later that evening, after Sophie was asleep, Eli sat at his laptop composing his acceptance email for the Chief Innovation Officer position. The role represented everything he'd hoped for when he first interviewed at Sinclair: technology's meaningful work, financial security, and the opportunity to make a difference on a scale he'd never imagined possible. But more than that, it represented the completion of a transformation that had begun with humiliation and evolved through crisis into something approaching redemption. The man who had been dismissed as unsuitable for corporate work was being asked to reshape how that corporation approached innovation. His phone buzzed with a text from Avery. "Sophie called to tell me you're accepting the CIO position. She also invited me to go shopping for your new office decorations this weekend. I think I'm being managed by a 10-year-old. Eli smiled as he typed back. "She's very good at managing people. It's one of her many talents. One of many things she inherited from her father." The compliment was simple but meaningful, acknowledging not just his professional abilities, but his success as a parent, raising a remarkable child under difficult circumstances. It felt like recognition of everything that mattered most to him. He finished the acceptance email and sent it, officially committing to the next phase of their journey together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, the complex work of transforming organizational culture and implementing innovation on a massive scale. But tonight, Sophie was sleeping peacefully in her own room, surrounded by the security and stability he'd worked so hard to provide. Her latest drawing was taped to the Refrigeratora family portrait, showing 3 figures standing together in front of a tall building, with the words, "My family," written in careful block letters across the top. The drawing captured something essential about how their lives had evolved. They weren't a traditional family, but they were a chosen one, brought together by circumstances that had tested them all and revealed the best in each of them. Avery had learned to trust and be vulnerable. Eli had learned to forgive and build from disappointment. Sophie had learned that change could bring good things as well as loss. Standing at his window, looking out over the Seattle skyline, Eli thought about the path that had brought them to this moment. The humiliating interview that had seemed like an ending had become a beginning. The rescue that had felt like simple duty had become the foundation for transformation. The woman who had crushed his dignity had become someone he trusted with his daughter's happiness. Sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back. Sometimes second chances lead to possibilities you never could have imagined. Sometimes the worst moments in your life become the catalysts for the best ones. Tomorrow would bring the work of changing how an entire industry approached innovation, of proving that different perspectives could work together to create something better than either could achieve alone. But tonight was for gratitude, for appreciating how far they'd come and looking forward to possibilities that seemed limitless. The journey from unemployment and desperation to executive leadership and chosen family had taken exactly 1 year. But the real transformation from bitterness to hope, from isolation to connection, from surviving to thriving had taken place one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. Change was still coming, but now they were ready for it, together.